I chose to participate from Finland because I'm at the moment trying to reduce my flights to absolute minimum. And thank you for Stephanie to accommodating this. It's really nice to meet you, and I hope the connection is going to remain stable and nice, so you can hear me properly. But yeah, my name is Idil, and I'm assistant professor of sustainable design at Aalto University, and I'm going to talk about design for sustainability transformations. Or transitions. I prefer increasingly more to use the word transformations. Building up, or maybe building up on what Fabrizio has presented, specifically opening up the socio-technical / ecological levels. So just to set the kind of background, I kind of want to see the hands of those who have seen this image before. Excellent. So you are very familiar. This is actually a juxtaposition of two pieces of visualized versions of two pieces of work. One from Stockholm Resilient Center, Planetary Boundaries, and the other one from Kate Raworth, who wrote Donut Economics. You know the story. Essentially, we are approaching tipping points in Earth's physical systems with increasing risk, and also we are failing to meet social foundations. So we're kind of hitting a perfect storm head on. And climate is changing, but it actually has already changed. So 1 degree Celsius warming compared to pre-industrial levels has already occurred. And at the moment, we are desperate to keep the temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius, but kind of heading towards 2 degrees Celsius and potentially more. To kind of frame the importance of, or the significance of, and the necessity of actually urgent action to try to cap the temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. In October 2018, IPCC has published a special report comparing the impacts between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius increase using highly sophisticated quantitative scenario modeling. You also might be familiar with this, but just to set the context, there's actually a huge difference in impact in such a small change in temperature rise. So 0.5 degrees make a huge difference. So both in social and environmental systems. As an example, poverty and disadvantage are expected to increase in some populations as global warming increases. And keeping the temperature rise at 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred million by 2050. And as an example of ecosystem-related change, so we're already facing, of course, quite mass bleaching of corals. And at the moment, I think we've lost a significant amount of corals because of acidification. And if we keep the temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are able to keep the remaining corals, 90% of the remaining. We are able to keep, I think, I can't now specifically remember the numbers, but let's put it in quantitative terms. So if we fail to keep the temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are actually going to lose close to 90% of the remaining coral. Whereas if we actually succeed to keep temperature rise at 1.5 degrees, then we are going to be able to save quite a large percentage of the remaining corals. So huge stakes in relation to climate change action. But climate change is only one of many systemic challenges. So if we look at this global risks landscape, you can see that at the moment, extreme weather events are seen as highly likely. They have high likelihood to realize, and also high impact when they realize. And failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation is also quite high risk, high impact. Then these are of course not in isolation. So global risks are interconnected, and in this visualization, you can see how many connections exist between failure of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and other risks. The thicker the line gets, the stronger the interconnection or interrelatedness is. And the number of lines that are coming out from one risk indicates the number of, how many other risks it is interconnected. So basically failing to mitigate and adapt to climate change actually increases the likelihood and impact of several other risks. So huge stakes are at the table at the moment, and we must rethink how the world actually works in order to be able to address the challenge in the required time. And I use in my work sustainability model in opposition to weak sustainability model. Weak sustainability model is also the kind of underlying model behind triple bottom line reporting, which is the primary reporting model for companies. Weak sustainability model assumes that you can replace the capital lost in environment and society by financial or economic capital. But of course, this is actually not true. You cannot replace fully the capital or the value lost in environment and society by way of increasing your economic output. And also in cases where replacement is possible, it's not in the favor of economy, environment and society. So that's a very flawed model, but unfortunately that is the model that is underlying our policy making, our education, our funding, research funding mechanisms, and definitely how business handles or thinks about these things. So this is the first message that I would like to give to you, that if we are going to operate at the transitions, transformations level, then we really need to understand the hierarchical interdependencies between an environment, society, and economy, and adopt a strong sustainability position in our design innovation work, in our business operations, in our innovation policy making. So, very strong message from me: we must change our futures now. And if we come back to this image, when we talk about sustainability or sustainable transformations, we're actually talking about three-dimensional change at the meta level. So we talk about reducing impact, that is mitigation, and we're talking about adapting to already locked-in impact. So that 1 degree Celsius and also the inevitable 1.5 degrees Celsius future increase, potentially 2. The impacts are already locked in, and we are experiencing some of those impacts. And in the coming 20 to 50 years, I think, many of us will still be alive in 40, 50 years. Definitely the children and the youth of today will be around. It means significant lifestyle changes are both going to be required, but also are going to be forced upon us, because we cannot continue to run our socio-technical ecological systems in the way that we have been so far. And then comes the concept that is less visible in these discourses, particularly in engineering and design schools, and that's justice. So when we are transitioning, we actually we have an ethical responsibility to ensure inter and intragenerational justice, but also increasingly interspecies justice is being put on the plate. So yes, this requires transitions or transformations, which are structural, long-term, and radical changes, and they're highly complex, they're dynamic, they're long-term. The stakeholder base is very large. It's essentially practically the whole human society, and potentially at least some portion of the non-human society, if we can call them society. They will replace, and they're already replacing institutions. They challenge power structures. There are a lot of vested interests in existing systems. So you cannot change systems overnight, but changing the systems require undoing the current power structures, and that's a huge political and economic challenge. And then they're underlined by high uncertainty. So they're not easy processes. And bringing it back to the framework that Fabrizio very nicely and so much in detail explained, we are, when we talk about design at the level of sustainability transitions, we're actually covering all of the levels that Fabrizio has walked you through. And all of those levels are relevant and required. But on top of that, design for sustainable transitions should and can and does act as an overarching framework to kind of guide and anchor all of the design and innovation activities that happen across the levels. And one thing Fabrizio didn't show is this emerging level, that socio-technical, ecological system level. So now we are seeing in the design field not only a focus on socio-technical systems, but a focus on, and rightly so, socio-ecological technical systems. So when we come to design for sustainability transformations, it is an interdisciplinary area and transdisciplinary practice, combining design research, future studies, sustainable science, and transition theories. And it is essentially trying to ask and answer how can we transform socio-ecological technical systems through design and innovation. And it's before coming to what is designing for sustainable transformations, I'm going to show you a quick example of what it is not. So This is only one example of several Kickstarter, Indiegogo, etc. Startup projects. As you know, there's a lot of focus on plastics at the moment and plastic pollution, and there are policies in Europe to combat that. But what is coming out as innovation is unfortunately only shifting the burden to different parts of the system. So this is, it doesn't matter the brand or the specific company who is doing this particular bottle, because there are reusable bottle, cup, blah, 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 innovations coming up at a pace that is actually worrying me, increasingly more than the plastic problem that they are trying to address, because they're not going to address the problem. This is a smart reusable bottle, okay? So what is a smart reusable bottle? I have a reusable bottle that is stainless steel. I've been using it for 12 years. It's always in my bag, winter, summer, cycling, on public transport, at work, in the gym, etc. And I'm wondering why my bottle is stupid, so that we need a smart bottle. And what does that mean, right? What is a smart bottle? So it happens that this bottle actually reminds you when you need to drink water, because obviously we are stupid and we don't have the biological mechanisms inherent in us that remind us that we are thirsty. So we need a smart reusable bottle to remind us that. So this is a very forced concept. It's over-designed, and in my opinion, it's a quite terrible example of greenwashing. Rather than being a solution, it is actually a problem on its own, because these things are going to be discarded in, I don't know what's the life cycle, but 5-10 years, let's say maximum, and this is going to be very difficult to manage in the waste stream because it is smart. Well, because it's not smart, it is actually stupid. So this is not design for sustainable transformations. And when you come to, okay, but what are we talking about? Well, so first of all, design for sustainable transformations is not only a what's next, but a where to approach. So, rule, vision comes first. And unfortunately, the post-war and still dominant mainstream management literature created this concept of realistic vision in the context of company strategy. But I would like to urge you this conception. I would like to urge you to think about this conception, realistic vision. Well, it's actually a self-contradicting concept, because visions need to be idealistic, free, open, and innovative, particularly in the context of systemic transformations. So, if a vision does not imply discontinuity, a plural and kind of addresses plurality of perspectives on how change should happen and what kind of change we want to happen, and if it is not relatable by the various stakeholders, that is not a good vision. So there's no such thing as a realistic vision, because we need boundary-pushing futures thinking, because we have to use actually design to probe the limits of our current reality and to make new realities possible. And in the context of sustainable transformations, I do see design to have certain unique skills and capacities that actually could assist with this boundary pushing futures thinking. So, moving on to a very rough process guide for transitions, and it's the same for design for transitions. But how you start with is you first, of course, analyze the problem. You map the problem, you analyze their current stakeholders, their motivations, their ideas of what is a desirable, sustainable, post-carbon, etc. future, and understand concerns and understand the relationships between actors in the current system. Then, though, before taking any other step into the next, you actually go to where to. So you create a vision of futures or visions of futures that are radically different than now, that are desirable, sustainable, post-carbon, and of course, they have to be very contextual. So the vision that you develop for your country or for your city or for your neighborhood may not be relevant for a neighborhood in Finland, for example. After developing a vision, you backcast and you start creating transition pathways, indicating or meaning, okay, so how can we come back from this vision back to our current present reality? And in fact, it's not very easy, and my whole PhD was about how can we link present with radically different visions, and I used a combination of backcasting and foresighting scenarios, so a double scenario method to overcome the weaknesses of both approaches. However, assuming that you created transition pathways and managed to link conceptually and analytically link present with the vision, then you start to identify experiments that actually can help with moving towards the vision. But because we don't actually know which experiments will work, we need to do as many as possible low-cost experiments to learn from and to iterate with. So it's a whole learning process which is very iterative and requires wide stakeholder engagement. And along the way, you observe, you reflect, you learn, you reframe, and continue doing experiments and scaling up those experiments that are actually highly promising for assisting us to transition. And now I'm going to talk about the work that I did in Australia before moving to Finland. Fabrizio quite shortly mentioned about this, so now I'm going to unpack that so that you could hopefully have a sense of what it takes to be involved in these kind of projects, transformation related projects. So this project is called, in short, VP 2040. It's visions, scenarios and pathways for low carbon resilient futures in Australian cities. It's now finished. It was a design engagement and action research project with three main academic actors. So I was working in the Vail Victorian Eco-Innovation Lab in the University of Melbourne. Vail was a futures design action laboratory, and it strategically worked with stakeholders using education and research to help stakeholders to develop these visions and pathways and etc. And it did a whole lot of projects in addition to Visions and Pathways project, but this was the largest of all of the projects that Vail did. And I was working in Vail as a design researcher and a sustainability scientist, and I was collaborating with two other researchers from two other universities, one from University of New South Wales. So in Vail, we had design research, we had systems dynamics modeling, we had futures inquiry competences, and in UNSW, the researcher there was a climate policy expert and an unorthodox economist, as he identified. And in Swinburne University, we were working with a researcher who was specifically an expert in the practice of futures inquiry methods. Then we had a set of partners from private sector. So Oricon and AECOM are international engineering consultancies. They're quite large. And then Hassel is an Australian landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning consultancy. And Brookfield Multiplex is a local company that produces air conditioning units. In addition to private sector partners, we worked with local governments, including City of Melbourne, City of Sydney, Government of South Australia, and Sydney Water, and also local governments of Perth and Adelaide. They were the two other cities. We focused in this project on cities. And the reason why cities are significant intervention points for climate change action is because that's where the problem is concentrated. Rural cities are responsible for up to 70, according to some other resources, up to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, while occupying just 2% of its land. And when you put this in the context of the urbanizing world, where in 2050, 70% of the world's population is projected to be living in urban environments, the picture that cities are where a problem is concentrated becomes much clearer and significant. And then their agency is increasing. So interestingly enough, cities are gaining power over nation states. And this gives them, gaining power, particularly economic power. So the largest 300 cities account for nearly half of the world's economic output, yet contain 19% of the world's population. And some of these cities outperform their countries. And we do see, as the national governments fail to agree on targets or start taking action, cities have been networking globally and learning from one another and doing actually quite a lot of work to get their cities basically, mitigate emissions and adapt to whatever vulnerabilities and risks are imposed by climate change. And then the third reason is they actually are behinds of creativity and innovation, and they play a significant role in social movements, reclaiming democratic and environmental rights. So on one hand, they're where the problem is concentrated, but also hypothetically, at least, they provide enormous opportunity for solutions to be generated and implemented. So when we think about cities, we immediately think about the built environment, but of course, cities are much more than built environment. Built environment is the enabling layer for all of these activities to happen. And then on one hand, the built environment is public space, private space, and infrastructure. So all of this enables all of the activities that take place in cities. And then there are these provisional systems that are basically necessary for any city to function properly. And these systems are interconnected in reality. So you can't actually think about food without thinking about energy system, or you can't think about food without thinking about water system, etc. But these are currently, in the current political structures, are treated as completely separate systems, which then results in maladaptation, basically. So we need transformations in all of these systems, and somehow this transformation needs to be governed. This is the challenge of urban transition. They're complex systems and they're large, and you need to think concurrently about multiple systems. So in this project, we focused on urban as a complex system, and we followed the design-led methodology, which was very participatory, iterative, creative, analytical, and integrative in its process. And it was a truly interdisciplinary project. This is the tamed version of a super messy project process that we followed. We did quite a lot of desktop research. Part of it was understanding drivers of urban change, understanding emerging technologies, business models or organizational models, social movements, etc., that could be part of transition narratives that could actually assist in transitions. We did visioning workshops in Melbourne and Sydney, which were followed by 1 week long design workshops. So of course, Bale has design research capacity, but we also commissioned professional designers to help us in the visioning workshops to harvest the visions that are emerging from our stakeholder base. And in these design workshops, we put our desktop research insights, and designers brought the visioning workshop insights, and we have created a series of visualizations of critical moments of the futures that are envisioned. We call them glimpses of the future. We did expert interviews, and we did workshops or expert workshops on specific topics that we thought were quite relevant. And we have integrated or synthesized our findings and insights into prototype scenarios. They are skeletons of alternative futures. We took these prototype scenarios to a scenarios workshop to get them challenged, but also get them fleshed out. And eventually we released 4 scenarios. So this is showing findings of our research on drivers of urban change. As you can see, there are multiple drivers across multiple dimensions. And in an ideal world with endless money, we would have investigated each and every one of these drivers to understand what role that driver could play in transitions, but we didn't, of course, have endless resources, so we focused on a few of those drivers that we thought to be quite significant and important, and did expert workshops on them. We released several working papers along the way, and also expert workshop reports. These were important to engage with our stakeholders, but also to structure the mass amount of knowledge that we were generating through our research. So the visions that are created were systemic in the sense that they did not represent particular provisional systems, but they represented different scales in an urban context. So, for example, we had glimpses or visions of urban life experienced at micro level by residents and at household building scale. We had glimpses at the scale of communities, precinct neighborhoods, and then we had glimpses at the scale of cities and the broader environment. We also had these glimpses that we call critical biology objects, that you could also refer to as speculative visions or speculative glimpses. These were unfeasible, non-feasible from a technological point of view, but had quite symbolic depth and actually resulted in the most rich discussions among stakeholder groups. So, visions are very important, and they open up, or they can help us open up new conversations and assist with breaking from the existing perceptions of possibilities that underpin planning and design decisions. And both the process of generating visions, but also the visions themselves, can be considered as a feedback loop, because they highlight tensions, portray existing practices that are seeds of alternative futures, and also make potential new areas for innovation visible and viable. As a result of our visioning work and desktop work and expert workshops and interviews work, we identified certain points of contention among our stakeholder community about what is desirable and feasible for them. So these are basically the critical uncertain dimensions of futures. And here you see what you see is a set of critical uncertainties that were most dominant. And we took these critical uncertainties, we considered these critical uncertainties in creation of these scenario prototypes. So what you see in these scenario prototypes is kind of skeletons of futures in the dimensions of where emission reductions are achieved, the physical, the nature of interactions between people, whether they are physical or virtual, and along that spectrum, the value basis of societies, whether it's egalitarian or meritocratic, and whether they're individualistic or community-centered, and the kind of dominant players, whether it's market, whether it's government, or whether it's civil society. So as I said, we took these to a scenarios workshop, got them challenged, fleshed out. So it was a process of both strengthening their logic, depth into them, and also testing their resilience. And then after a long process of cognitive and creative thinking, we released these 4 scenarios. So what you see here, the rows represent scenarios, and the columns represent the scenarios, and then the rows represent generic urban density levels. And you can see the logic of the scenarios, how it changes from one scenario to the other. And these visualizations are actually visualizations of real places. So it was important for us to bring that layer of relatability, that it's a familiar place, but it's completely different based on what kind of drivers took overtook the stage during transitions. And then in the bottom you can see the keywords, but these visualizations are not scenarios themselves. The scenarios are actually quite detailed texts. You can find them in the scenarios report from the project. These visualizations, very detailed, communicating the basic logics of these worlds. So in terms of, you know, what kind of business models are there, what kind of technologies are there, what kind of welfare systems are there or not there, and the relationships between people and nature, and etc. So this is the clean tech market living. This is planned regulated living. This is entrepreneurial living, and then this is community balanced living. Then these scenarios fall across this spectrum of efficiency increase versus consumption reduction in regards to how did we achieve emissions or mitigation targets. So the theory is that you either increase efficiency of the systems or you decrease consumption. And then you can see that these four scenarios are spread kind of evenly along this spectrum. And what we found is that the dominant narrative at the moment is this clean tech market living futures, and the mainstream discussions about circular economy and how it's going to save everything is actually falling into this clean tech market living scenario. But what this graph shows is, well, one thing that this graph doesn't show, you can't actually achieve mitigation targets by solely implementing policies focusing on efficiency increase. But what the graph shows is that in the assumption that we actually achieve mitigation targets in the clean tech market living scenario, it's not a resilient society, because there's a lot of inequality in that future. So that's not just, and that's not resilient. And then another thing in this graph, implicit, is that what futures we're going to get, whichever futures we're going to get, it doesn't matter. There's always going to be trade-off on certain things. So you either give up on your ideal of justice and you create an unequal society, or you give up on your technological aspirations and you create a society that's based on a lot of bottom-up initiatives, and it's low tech. And then these scenarios fall across this matrix of governance. So two of them are top-down futures, and two of them are bottom-up decentralized governance futures. And then two of them are meritocratic futures, and then two of them are egalitarian futures. And the dominant actors in these four are big corporations in clean tech market living, or in another word, who has the main power, who is really ruling the society. In planned regulated living, it's big government. In community balanced living, it's citizens and community organizations. And in entrepreneurial network living, it's a network of freelance workers and prosumers. Then, none of these futures are actually the future that we are going to see realizing. Future is probably going to be a mosaic of all of these and certain other things that we we did not, or we cannot at the moment imagine because of the uncertainties and other things. But all of these futures have advocates in the present socio-political economic system advocating for these futures. So we looked at this, and that was my alarm telling me, you gotta rush, no time left, so I'll be quick. So in these four scenarios, we actually have in current society advocates who claim that these are the desirable futures that we need to move towards. And clean tech marketing, as the promoters are free market economists and progressive businesses and technological optimists, at the moment dominate the conversation, policy-making processes in small and larger scales, but there are these other alternatives that we really need to be seriously thinking about, and the advocates of these futures need to be engaged in the discussions in order for the society to move towards futures that are desirable, more or less desirable, or agreeable at least, at a minimum, by all stakeholder groups. And we also tap into the knowledge and perspectives of these other actors, and not rely on the ambitions of who is most powerful at the moment in society. So that gives you an idea on what kind of work design researchers may do in the context of transitions. Design researchers cannot do work on their own in the context of transitions. Neither can do policy experts, neither can do ecologists. We have to collaborate, so that's a very important message that I would like to give here. There is no such thing as designing a transition by a design community. Unfortunately, work doesn't work like that. Or fortunately, work doesn't work like that. The best thing we can do is taking part in these consortium projects, and next I'm talking about so we're working on in collaboration with several expert groups. What do we really do? What is our role or roles of design, even if not the designer, in transition processes? So I used this project. I worked in that as a researcher and did all of the basic research that was necessary. But I also used it as a case study to look at what roles design play in transition processes. So what you see here is a model from Lorbach, Dirk Lorbach, who is known for Transitions Management book, and he talks about there being three main activities in transitions processes. So these are strategic activities, which is about formation of long-term goals and visions. There's the tactical activities, which is about implementing a change agenda. And then there are operational activities, which are about experiments and learning by doing at the niche level. So I analyzed our kind of 3 years of work and very different types of data, including my own reflective journal. And I have identified these roles played by design in the whole process of the project. And what I have found, interestingly enough, is only 2 of these goals, sets of goals, are the roles that are traditionally attributed to designers, and the others are in a way new roles or emerging roles that design plays or can play in transition contexts, which then, of course, has a lot of implications on design education and design research. But I'm not going to talk about those. If this material is interesting for you, you can find all of my papers online just by searching my name. But this is the end of my presentation, so I would like to thank all of you